On June 23, 1985, Air India Flight 182, en route from Montreal, Canada to London, England, was destroyed mid-flight by a bomb, killing all 329 passengers and crew on board. This tragic event, known as the Air India Flight 182 bombing, remains one of the deadliest acts of aviation terrorism in history and the worst mass murder in Canadian history. The attack was the result of a complex plot orchestrated by Sikh extremists seeking revenge against the Indian government. This narrative explores the events leading up to the bombing, the investigation, and the lasting impact of this horrific act of terrorism.
The political context behind the Air India Flight 182 bombing can be traced back to the tensions between the Sikh community and the Indian government during the 1980s. In 1984, the Indian Army launched Operation Blue Star to remove Sikh militants who had taken refuge in the Golden Temple, the holiest site in Sikhism, in Amritsar, Punjab. The operation resulted in significant casualties and widespread anger within the Sikh community, both in India and among the diaspora. In retaliation for Operation Blue Star, Sikh extremists based in Canada, led by the militant group Babar Khalsa, sought to carry out attacks against Indian interests. The group, led by Talwinder Singh Parmar and other key conspirators, plotted to bomb Air India flights, targeting the national airline as a symbol of the Indian state. Their plan was to place bombs in luggage and have them detonate mid-flight, causing catastrophic loss of life.
The plot to bomb Air India flights was meticulously planned. The conspirators intended to target two separate flights: Air India Flight 182, traveling from Canada to India via London, and Air India Flight 301, departing from Japan. They coordinated their efforts to have the bombs explode simultaneously, causing maximum impact and confusion. On June 22, 1985, a suitcase containing the bomb destined for Flight 182 was checked in at Vancouver International Airport. The bag was tagged for transfer to Air India Flight 182 from Canadian Pacific Airlines Flight 60, which was flying from Vancouver to Toronto. Meanwhile, a second suitcase containing another bomb was checked in for Flight 301, but this bomb exploded prematurely at Narita Airport in Japan, killing two baggage handlers and preventing further loss of life.
At 7:14 a.m. GMT on June 23, 1985, Air India Flight 182, a Boeing 747 named Kanishka, was cruising at 31,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean, about 120 miles off the coast of Ireland. Suddenly, a powerful explosion tore through the forward cargo hold, causing the aircraft to break apart mid-air. The plane crashed into the sea, killing all 329 people on board, including 268 Canadian citizens, 27 British citizens, and 24 Indian citizens. The passengers included families, business travelers, and 82 children. The scale of the tragedy was overwhelming, and the loss was felt deeply across the world, particularly in Canada and India. Rescue efforts were launched immediately, but they only recovered wreckage and the bodies of 132 victims. The rest were lost to the ocean's depths.
The investigation into the bombing was one of the most complex and challenging in aviation history. It involved multiple international agencies, including the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, CSIS, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, and British authorities. The initial focus was on determining how the bomb was placed on the aircraft and identifying those responsible. The investigation revealed significant security lapses, including inadequate screening of luggage and a lack of coordination between intelligence agencies. Evidence pointed to the involvement of Sikh extremists in Canada, with the primary suspects being Talwinder Singh Parmar and Inderjit Singh Riat, both associated with the Babur Khalsa group. Riat, who assembled the bombs, was later convicted of manslaughter and perjury, but despite extensive efforts, the masterminds behind the plot were not brought to full justice due to lack of conclusive evidence and witness intimidation. The investigation also exposed severe shortcomings in Canada's counter-terrorism efforts at the time. Despite warnings and intelligence reports indicating a possible attack on Air India, authorities failed to take adequate preventive measures. This failure sparked outrage and led to accusations of systemic negligence and discrimination against the predominantly Sikh victims, who were Canadian citizens.
Legal proceedings related to the Air India bombing were lengthy and fraught with difficulties. In 1991, Inderjit Singh Riat was convicted in the Narita airport bombing case. He was later convicted in 2003 of manslaughter for his role in the Air India Flight 182 bombing, receiving a 5-year sentence, a punishment widely criticized as inadequate given the scale of the tragedy. In 2000, 2 other suspects, Rupudaman Singh Malik and Najib Singh Bagri, were charged with murder and conspiracy related to the bombing. Their trial, which began in 2003, became one of the longest and most expensive in Canadian history. In 2005, both men were acquitted due to lack of reliable evidence, largely because key witnesses either recanted their statements or were found to be unreliable, likely due to intimidation and fear of retribution. So the verdicts were a devastating blow to the families of the victims, who felt that justice had not been served. The failure to secure convictions against the primary suspects highlighted the challenges of prosecuting complex terrorism cases, particularly when evidence is circumstantial and witnesses are reluctant to testify.
The Air India Flight 182 bombing had profound and far-reaching impacts on aviation security and counter-terrorism policies in Canada and around the world. In the aftermath of the bombing, Canada significantly overhauled its aviation security protocols, including stricter baggage screening procedures, enhanced coordination between intelligence and law enforcement agencies, and the establishment of the Canadian Air Transport Security Authority (CATSA) in 2002. The tragedy also led to the creation of the Air India Inquiry. In 2006, a public commission tasked with investigating the bombing and the response of Canadian authorities. The final report, released in 2010, condemned the failures of the Canadian government and security agencies, stating that a cascading series of errors contributed to the failure of our police and security forces to prevent this atrocity. The inquiry's recommendations prompted further reforms, including improved intelligence sharing, increased support for victims of terrorism, and the creation of an integrated national security framework to better respond to threats of terrorism. Despite these changes, the bombing remains a painful reminder of the dangers posed by terrorism and the need for constant vigilance.
The legacy of the Air India Flight 182 bombing is one of grief, injustice, and the pursuit of truth and accountability. The families of the victims, many of whom were Canadian citizens of Indian descent, have fought tirelessly to keep the memory of their loved ones alive and to seek justice. Their efforts have brought attention to the need for greater support for the families of terrorism victims and for recognizing the attack as an integral part of Canadian history. For the Sikh community in Canada and around the world, the bombing and its aftermath have had complex and lasting effects. The actions of a small group of extremists have cast a long shadow, and the community has worked hard to counter the negative stereotypes and misconceptions that arose in the wake of the tragedy.
The Air India Flight 182 bombing was a devastating act of terrorism that claimed 329 innocent lives and left a profound impact on the families of the victims and on Canada as a whole. It exposed critical flaws in aviation security and counterterrorism measures and highlighted the need for greater vigilance and accountability. As we reflect on this tragedy, we remember the lives lost and the enduring strength of those who continue to seek justice and remembrance for their loved ones.